Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever and whenever you are. My name is Benjamin, and welcome to RPG Basics Part 24. In this video, I'm going to show you how to separate your input out and put it into its own input object. I'm going to show you how to add a simple pause function to the game that has a pause menu. Now, we're not going to actually make the pause menu work yet. We'll be doing that in the next video, but this is what we're going to have. Let me pause the game here. There we go. The game is paused. You can see we've got a pause menu that we can go through here, but they don't actually work. You can't do anything with this menu yet. But you press escape again and it will take you back to here. And everything will be just like it was before you pause the game. You'll notice our character's position. Even the view continues to move correctly. So it's a pretty cool little pause menu. Let's jump right in and get started. The first thing we need to do is to separate our input out into its own object. And the reason I chose to do this is because when you start to get multiple different objects that need to take input, it's nice to have just one input object that has all of your input in it, and then all of those other objects can just access that input object. So that's what we're going to do. Create a new object here, and we're going to name this object underscore input. Now inside of this input object, we're going to add a create event. Go to control, drag over a code action, and we're going to initialize the input object. Now in here, we're going to grab the input just like we were doing inside of the player. So we're going to do script get input right here. And we're also going to keep track of the last room we were in. And the reason we're doing that is for our pause menu. So we're going to say previous room equals room. That'll just store our current room into the previous room variable. And then what we're going to want to do is make sure that this object input is also persistent. So we want it to be persistent just like, maybe we don't have another persistent object. The player object's persistent, I think. So we're going to make it persistent. Come back into the input object right here and add an event, add a step event. Inside of the step event, we're going to get the input again. So let's do that here. Get the input so that we update every step, script get input. And then for now, we're just going to leave the rest of this blank like that. Okay, now we need to convert all of the input inside of our player object to access the object.input. But we also want to make sure that we only create the input the first time we run the game. So currently our room 1 is initializing, let's see, an object view and an object player stats. Let's have the player stats create the input object. So go into the player stats right here, add a new event, other, room start. Now the reason we're doing this is because the input object is persistent. So we don't want to recreate the input object every time we go back to the first room, because then we could have multiple input objects. So we're going to say create the input object, instance create. Since it's persistent and invisible, it doesn't matter where we create it. Object input, we'll just create it at 0, 0, like that. Press OK. We're good to go. Our input object is in the room. Now we need to go into the player and into the player's states. So come into the move state here and see how we have dash key right here and script get input. We're going to remove script get input right here, and then instead of dash key, we're going to do object input dot dash key. Now if you don't put the input object in the room, you're going to get an error message here. So you want to make sure that not put it in the room, but created. So you want to make sure that the input object gets created. Now every time you have any sort of an input, like attack key, we'll need to do object input dot attack key. And I think those are the only ones inside of here. Where's the dash? Oh, that's up here. We already did that. Okay, perfect. So we've got those, and then inside of the attack and dash state, we actually don't get input, but come into the player object again in the create event, and you can remove script get input right here. Okay. Now save the game and run it. We should be able to move, and everything should work just like it did before. Oh, I think the axis is the axes, whichever one that is. I think they were in the input as well. Let's check here. Come into the move state again, and where we're getting the axis right here. Yeah, x-axis and y-axis. I think these are in the input object as well. But that should be good. Okay, just make sure you convert the x-axis and y-axis to object input.x-axis and y-axis and make sure this works. There we go. Now we're moving just like we did before, but we're getting this input from our input object. Benefit of that is that our pause menu will also be able to use the input object. Great, so now let's add the pause menu into the game. So you're going to need to create a new room. So create a room up here. Name this rm_pause, so room pause. We're going to give it a width of 320 and a height of 180. We're going to give it a background of a dark gray color maybe. That should be fine. Now this room doesn't need a view, but what this room does need is you have to set the physics. Because we're using physics in this game, we have to set physics equal to true or you will get an error message. So it is a physics room, but technically we don't want any gravity. So I'm just going to do 0 there. Leave everything else the same. Now we have a pause menu. Now we need to be able to access this pause menu room. So we're going to go into our input object, and this is where we're going to handle this. So let me open up my reference over here. Inside of the step event, we're going to add some code here, and this is where we're going to pause the game. Pause the game. So we actually need to modify script get input so that it gets a pause key as well. So open up that. I just middle clicked on it, but you can just open up script get input, and we're going to add one in here called pause key equals keyboard check pressed. And I'm going to do VK escape again, even though I forgot it last time. You can choose whichever one you want to do there. And then you'll also want to do this for the gamepad, and you probably just want to use the start button on whatever gamepad you're using. So we're going to say pause key equals gamepad button check pressed. Device will be 0, and you do GP, and it should be start. GP start. Yep, right there. Okay, so this should work now for gamepads. Now if we come into here, when we want to pause the game, what we're going to do is check for the pause key. So if pause key, we don't have to do object_game.pause key because we're inside of the object, or sorry, object_input because we're inside of the input object currently. So now that we've done that, you can do if room does not equal room pause. So we're going to check, are we in the pause room right now? Else. So if it doesn't equal the pause room, we need to go to the pause room. But we also need to make sure that the player object is no longer persistent, because if the player object's persistent, he'll appear in the pause room too, and we don't want that. So we're going to say if instance exists object player, make sure the player exists first. If he does, object player dot persistent equals false. We're going to set the player's persistent to false. Now we're going to say previous room equals room, so we'll make sure we store the previous room that we were in, and then we're going to go to the pause room. Room go to room pause. Pause. There we go. Okay. Now if we're already in the pause room, we're just going to go to the normal room. So room, go to previous room. So we keep track of the previous room and then go there. Now we also need to change the player and give, so what we need to do actually is come into, now that you've done that, come into the object input and add a room start. Add event, other, room start. Now this is going to set the player's persistence back. So set the player's persistence, I think. So we do if instance exists, object underscore player, object underscore player dot persistent equals true. So we'll set the player back to persistent. The reason we need to do that is to make sure that the player will work inside of our room transition moving stuff. Okay, so we're looking good here. Let's save the game and run it. We don't have our pause menu in the game yet, but we should be able to pause the game, just no menu. There you go, you can see it does pause. Now our stats are dark and hard to see, so really quick, let's fix that. Go into the object player stats, and we're just going to set draw in the create event, draw set color C underscore white. That way our stats are at least white, they'll be easier to see. If you don't want to show the stats in the pause room, you can just do the same thing that we did with the player, which is make sure and set the stats not to persistent, and then set them back to persistent when we enter the room again. So now that we've done that, and actually let me check something here. I want to make sure. No, that should work. Okay, great. Now that we've done that, what we need to do is create our actual menu object that will allow us to navigate a menu. A menu that doesn't work, but that's okay. So we're going to save, we're going to add a new object, and we'll call this object pause menu. This doesn't need a sprite, but we will give it a create event. So add an event, create event. Now we're going to use some arrays. I think we've used arrays before, but if not, it's hard to remember because this series is so long. If not, I'm going to kind of explain them. So an array is kind of like a variable that can have multiple values attached to it. So it's really useful. So initialize the menu, and we're going to say the title of this is game paused. And then this menu is going to have some options. So we're going to say option 0, that's the first option, equals return. Option 1, there's our second option, equals save. Option 2 equals load. We're going to add saving and loading in this as well in the next couple of videos, so look out for those. Option 3 equals quit. And then we're going to store a menu index, and I'll explain that in just a bit. Equals menu index equals 0. We'll set it to 0. So we've got these different options, and our menu index is going to be which option we're on. So basically we'll start out on option 0 like that. Okay? Now what you need to do is add an alarm. We need an alarm because we're getting input from an analog stick. We can't use key pressed, so we need to have an alarm that checks the distance between certain like the down key and the up key to make sure that we don't cycle through the menu too quickly. So that's what our alarm is going to be for. So add an alarm, and you don't just drag over a code action and name this menu alarm. We're just going to use the alarm inside of our step event. So add an event, step event, drag over a code action. Inside of this step event, we're going to control the menu. Control the menu. So we're going to say if alarm 0 is less than or equal to 0. So we want to make sure that before we try and do any of this, that we have waited a sufficient amount of time since the last time we tried to do any of this. If object input dot down key. See, this is the benefit of separating your input out into a separate object, because now our menu can use the same input that the player is using. Okay? If menu index is less than array length 1D option -1. Okay, that's a little confusing. What we're checking is to make sure that our index is less than the total length of this array. So our array is technically, let's see, 4 long. So we just want to make sure we're less than 4. Okay? That's what we're doing here. We're less than 4. If we are less than 4, then menu index ++. Else, that means we're at the end of the array. We want to loop back around to the start. So menu index equals 0. That should loop us back around to the start of our menu. Now we're going to do another, and then we want to set the alarm. Alarm 0 equals room speed divided by 6. That's the value that I found works for me. It's 1/6 of a second. You can try different values if you feel like it's too fast or not fast enough. Now we're going to do if object input dot up key. We're going to do if menu index is greater than 0. We're going to subtract from it. So if we're not at the start, we're going to subtract it back. Menu index minus minus semicolon. Else menu index equals array length 1D option -1. So we're looping back to the end of the array. And then we want to set the alarm. Alarm 0 equals room speed divided by 6. Sweet! Now we should be able to navigate the menu, but we're not actually drawing the menu at all. So there's no way to see that we're actually navigating this. So come into, let's see, add an event, add a draw event, draw GUI. Drag over a code action, and we're going to call this draw the text. Well, the menu, I should say. So we're going to create kind of a center to start with here. So we're going to say var xx equals display get GUI width divided by 2. So this is the center of the GUI layer, or the GUI layer. Var yy equals display get GUI width, height divided by 2. So the first one should be width divided by 2. Width and height. Okay? Now we're going to set the draw alignment. So we're going to say draw set h align fa center. So we're going to center the horizontal alignment. Now we're going to draw text. And we're going to draw this text at xx yy minus 64. And it's going to be title. So we're drawing the title text. Now we're going to draw the menu. And this is cool. And this is part of why we use arrays, is now we can use a for loop to loop through each element of our array and draw each text. So we're going to say for var I equals 0, I is less than array length 1D option -1 I ++. Okay, that's our for loop. That should loop through the entire array, right? Starting at index 0, going to the end of the array. And then we're going to draw set color. We're going to set it to sea gray. Then we're going to say if I is equal to menu index. Basically, so if our selected menu option is also equal to the current I value that we're on, we're going to change the color. Draw set color C white. I should probably add the U into this one up here. I don't know for sure that that one works without the U. Draw set color C white. Okay. That will just draw all the other options gray, but the one we're selecting, it will be drawn as white. Draw text XX YY plus I times 32. And then we're going to say option, which is the array, the text that we're going to draw, I. Okay, that's a little fancy, but what we're doing is we're using the current I position to draw each text relative to that. And then we're also drawing the option I position. So it loops through our array, draws each text in a slightly different position on the screen. Really cool. Now we're going to say draw set color C white. We need to set that back. And we also need to set back the H alignment. So draw set H align FA left. Okay, now we just need to put this object in our pause menu. So go into the pause menu and add our pause menu object. Doesn't matter where you put it because it will draw in the middle of the room anyways. And then what we should have a nice pause menu for our game. It's not drawing the last one. So come back into the pause menu. I must have done something wrong in here. Draw GUI. Okay, I did less than. It should be less than or equal to inside of the for loop. I is less than or equal to the array length. Okay? Because we're subtracting 1 from it. You could do less than if you didn't subtract 1, but we are. So there we go. We've got all options here. You can see we can loop through them. If you hold down the up arrow, it will navigate through them like that. If you do it pretty fast, you can move through all of them as well. So seems to be working really well. Pause menu looks good. Let's make sure it works with our other room. So I'm going to run into the other room here real quick. Come into the other room. Should be some enemies in here. Oh, that enemy's chasing me. I'm going to pause. Oh, save the game just in case I die. And that didn't work. So let's figure out what happened there. Okay, so actually because I just did some debugging and because our room 1 only actually gets initialized once because it is a persistent room, we are able to actually create the object inside of this room. So if you come to your input object over here inside of room 1, you can just put your input object inside of the room and then go into your player stats here and you can delete the game start event for the player stats. So we don't need to worry about that because it works just like the stats. Because the room is persistent, it's okay that we put it in here. So now we should check, make sure our pause. Is this room not persistent? It should be persistent. Let me double check that. Room, settings. This room isn't persistent. Okay, so room 1 should be persistent. And room 2 should also be persistent. Okay, no wonder we were having issues there. Okay, so that's the real problem. It was probably fine the other way, but this works too. You need to make sure that the room is persistent. Now, this is also useful because if you were to kill some enemies in a room and then go back to the other room, those enemies would still be gone. So we got this enemy chasing us. We can pause, come back. Okay, things are working now. Yeah, the rooms, if your rooms aren't persistent, they probably should be. And it makes it so that if you kill enemies and you go back to that other room, those enemies will be gone. It's kind of better that way. If you didn't want your room to be persistent, the option is that you can make your object input set the room to persistent only while you're away from it and then set it back to not persistent when you come back. Just like we're doing the player here. You could do the same thing for the room. That way your pausing would still work, but your room wouldn't be persistent. Enemies would be back where they were when you started. So I'm going to leave it persistent. I'm going to leave the room as persistent. and do it this way, but I just wanted to explain that option to you as well. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Hopefully you found it helpful. If you did, be sure and like this video and share it on Twitter or Facebook or Tumblr or wherever. Make sure and subscribe. Check out my website for more content like this, where you can get some courses or books, and I will talk to you guys later.